Okay, let's deal with the obvious question first, which is that if George Russell's Mercedes had been on the exact minimum weight limit, legal in other words, would it have been able to have done that amazing 34-lap stint on the hard Pirelli tyre, the one-stop strategy that seemed to have won him the Belgian Grand Prix? My feeling is that he would have, because the margins we're talking about in terms of the weight discrepancy was so small as to make little or no difference actually to the performance of the car. But it's one of these things. It's a rule, it's a rule, it's a rule. You're 1 millimetre out, you're out. And commiserations to George Russell, because he was elated, he was ecstatic after the race, and justifiably so. He pulled off a feat which we don't often see in Formula One, which is to go completely against prognostications, against forecasts from Pirelli, against all the other strategies that the teams are thinking of. And gut feel in the middle of the race felt that the hard Pirelli tyre was getting quicker with every lap. Nobody else said that, although Oscar Piastri came near it at Spa when he suddenly found himself in clear air and said, wow, clear air is king, because he had grip, he had balance, and he was going very, very quickly at that stage of the race. Maybe then, in retrospect, was the moment when McLaren might have thought, yeah, but maybe the hard tyres are getting quicker with every lap as well. They would have heard George Russell's comments, but nonetheless, it was a big, big ask to change strategy midway through. The other point, of course, is that George was never in contention for the lead in the way that perhaps Oscar Piastri was, or certainly as Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were. He was always in a position where he could maybe take a gamble, if it was a gamble, but he did it on gut feel, and it's not the first time we've seen George driving like this. He's an amazingly adaptable driver, and all credit to him for that call. He's quite spiky with his inputs, but we've seen it from F3 through F2 and now in F1. Time and again, he manages to get a massive amount out of the tyres when other teams, when other cars and other drivers seem to have the tyres go off quite quickly. By contrast, for example, Max Verstappen was complaining about the fronts going away, the hard front going away in the middle stint when he was running that hard tyre. And they gave him some instructions about how to balance that with the diff, and he duly managed to find some time. But he was racing against George Russell at that point, and he was making no headway at all against George. That was a pivotal moment of the race, I think. We're talking about just before half distance. And there was Max, having got relatively clear air, having got through the crud, if you like. He was now in a position maybe to start challenging for P3, a podium, P4 maybe. But there's nothing he could do about George Russell. Indeed, George was getting away from him. But we don't want to get too far away from the reality of the day, which is that because George Russell has been excluded because his car was underweight, the win of the Belgian Grand Prix goes to Lewis Hamilton in the other Mercedes. It was so interesting. I mean, it was fascinating looking at the body language of both Lewis and George after the race. I think some of it was, yeah, Lewis is leaving the team, so George is like kind of our chosen guy for the future. And there was a lot of adulation of George, a lot of kissing, a lot of hugging of mechanics, justifiably so, probably. And Lewis, for a while, was a solitary figure behind the weigh-in area. And you had to feel a bit sorry for him because he'd done that brilliant qualifying lap in the wet. Mainly, as I pointed out yesterday, with fabulous driving into Pouin and other very difficult parts of Spa as well. Did a really good job. And it all came to nothing from his point of view, because finishing second, you might as well finish last in that situation. But now, what's happened? Lewis Hamilton is the winner of the Belgian Grand Prix, and he won it by partly because of that great qualifying lap and where it put him, and secondly, because he just ran a straightforward copybook strategy and a copybook race in reality. He got past Sergio Perez very quickly coming out of Eau Rouge. Very good run on the opening lap of the race. Got Perez into Les Combes. And then he was second to Charles Leclerc for a lap or two. And then he breezed past Charles with DRS going into Les Combes and started to pull away to a pretty impressive lead. And at this stage, based on everything we'd seen on Friday when it was dry, and it was dry on race day, you had to think the big challenge is going to come from McLaren. But McLaren-Mercedes challenge kind of dissipated by 50% at the first corner. Lando Norris made a pretty good start, better start than he normally does. He was kind of alongside Oscar Piastri, but on the outside, Oscar had a really good run down to the inside of La Source and was actually on a very good run down the hill behind Lewis and Sergio Perez, and had to brake and change down as they went into Eau Rouge. He was on such a good run there. But Lando Norris on the outside of La Source ran wide, put a left rear on the dirt as they came down the hill, and lost about 3 places going down the hill. And that was kind of the end of his challenge in a way, because what we saw then And it affected so many drivers in the race. What we saw then was a Belgian Grand Prix coloured by, yes, by those three very distinctive sectors: fast first sector, fast third sector. Middle sector requires a lot of downforce, a lot of medium speed, high speed corners, and that's where the Red Bull had always been good on Friday and was good yesterday as well. But what we saw at this Belgian Grand Prix, and I think more than any other Belgian Grand Prix since 2022, when we've had the new Formula One regulations, was how difficult it was to follow other cars at Spa. Almost impossible to overtake if you were in some sort of DRS train in Sector 1 or indeed in Sector 3. And that's not the Belgian Grand Prix that the Formula One FIA designers of this regulation promised us when they said the new cars are there to make overtaking much easier. It's much easier to follow other cars. And this circuit, of course, it's high speed with lots of high speed corners. That's the difference. And I think more than any other track so far since the beginning of this new regulation, we saw how difficult it was now to follow another car. And a classic example of that is the race of Max Verstappen, because through sectors 1 and 3, he was about the same as everyone else. His top speed was about the same as Ferrari and McLaren and Mercedes. Sector 2 is where he had his advantage. But because Max was in a DRS train for most of the race, he couldn't use his advantage. He couldn't do anything in a straight line. He couldn't do any DRS passes because the car in front had its wing flattened as well. And when it came to Sector 2, where he did have his advantage, he couldn't get near any car, regardless of who it was, particularly George Russell, the number of laps he was behind George. And as a result, his tyres went away as well because he was in that dirty air. So a strange sort of race. I think that factor of how difficult it was to follow other cars was not something that was evident until we got to Spa this year. And of course, it is a factor of how they've made these cars since 2022 less susceptible to bouncing. The aerodynamics under the car, certain curves, certain compound curves, are more aggressive now, and they've created their own turbulence. And as a result, we're almost back. We probably are back to where we were in 2021 in terms of how difficult it is to follow the car in front. And I keep saying that because the whole ethos of this current Grand Prix car formula is to make it much easier to follow the car in front. And that's no longer the case, not on this sort of circuit anyway. And the other point, of course, today, going into the race, was the tyre strategy. We talked about George a little bit. I mean, if we think about that business of how the hard tyre started to feel better and better with every lap, which is the pivotal moment of the race, and George Russell and his team deciding to give it a go and just stay on out there. I can remember, obviously, when we had groove tyres, get rid of the grooves and the tyres became slicks. And Mario Andretti got the pole in 1968, the first Formula One race he ever drove at Watkins Glen, because he'd done a lot of Firestone tyre testing. And none of the other Firestone Formula One runners had done so. But he knew these tyres that they were going to run on the Formula One Lotus, his first Formula One Grand Prix. He tested them on the USAC cars. And he knew that the more you ran on these tyres, up to a point, the quicker they got. And that's what he did. He just stayed out and practiced and qualifying, and the car went round and round, didn't use any new sets, and got the pole. And it reminded me of that today with George Russell. It was just, is there a chemical reason for it? I was in touch with Pirelli to ask them if there was what their thoughts were about that, and if there'd be any specific reason why, if you went beyond a certain point, these hard tyres did start to actually pick up grip. The only response was, well, there was very, very low deg on the hard tyre, and that's always a good thing, obviously, as the fuel load gets lighter. But it doesn't really cover the point of, were these tyres actually getting stickier? And I think they were, because George Russell, under pressure from Lewis, once Lewis had realised, poor Lewis, he's there on the radio saying, how tight is this going to be? I'm okay to win this race. And it come back, well, it's going to be tight now, Lewis. And then he started to push it as hard as he could. Obviously, he was on the new set of hard tyres. Why not? And he got to within DRS range of George with 3 or 4 laps to go. But George set his fastest mid-sector time, Sector 2 time, which is all the corners, the fast corners, on his last lap. That's when he was green. He was personally green, which means that was the quickest lap he did in terms of the Sector 2 all day on those 34-lap-old hard Pirellis. So they were actually getting quicker. And I come back to the point of why nobody else realised that. I suppose everybody gets kind of locked into the strategy they've chosen. Carlos Sainz was an interesting one because he started on tyres, uniquely amongst the front runners of the race, started on hard tyres. And he got the lead because of that. And he was actually going quite well. But then he ran wide coming out of Stavlo. Obviously, the grip was going away. and he came in for a new set of mediums. But one wonders now whether if he'd gone a couple of laps more, maybe he would have got over that peak, and then the tyres would have got faster and faster, as they did. He couldn't have done the whole race with them, obviously, but and he'd obviously started the race on full tank, so it wasn't a direct parallel. I suppose the other one was Max Verstappen, and I don't think Red Bull ever thought about it because they put so much effort into ensuring that he had 2 sets of new medium tyres going into the race, and that was their kind of chosen race tyre. So Max started on the medium, he went to the new hard, didn't go particularly well, but he was in dirty air throughout. And then in the last stint, they put him on a new set of mediums. And very easy to say it now, very easy to say it sitting here, of course, but I was a bit surprised that they didn't have Max on a set of hard tyres when they took the covers off the cars on the grid. I suspect that's because they didn't know how difficult it was going to be to overtake at Spa. I mean, I've been glibly saying since Friday, if you're going to take a hit with the engine, 10-place grid penalty, etc., Spa's the place to do it, not that difficult to overtake. Well, guess what? It is difficult to overtake, as we now see, as I was saying earlier. With these current cars, really difficult now to follow the car in front. A lot of effect on the aero, a lot of effect on the tyre wear as well. So I guess that's why they didn't do it. The other reason, of course, is that Red Bull had focused very much on the medium being the race tyre. And had they started on the hard, yes, he probably would have made it last longer than, say, Carlos Sainz, a couple of laps more, and he might have been a little bit quicker and got track position, certainly when the pit stops came. And then they would have him on a new set of mediums, and he wouldn't have been on that for very long. But the problem was they didn't have another set of new hards, unlike Mercedes, who did have 2 sets of new tyres going into the race. Red Bull only had 1. Not that George needed the 2, but Lewis did, and that was always there in the background for George if he was going to come in at some point in the back end of the race. But Max didn't have that, so he would have been out on a used set of hards. Whether that would have been a massive probably would have been okay, given the fact that the hard tyre appeared to get better with every lap, so it may not have been a bad call. But all of those ifs and buts before the race, easy for me to say, difficult to make those calls before the race started, of course. So it was a very strange race. It was a race coloured by how difficult it was to follow other cars and by all these different sudden strategies coming in. I mean, Aston Martin also did the same strategy as George Russell. And they were within a second of their sort of nearest opposition who'd gone on the traditional strategy. They didn't have quite the same exponential advantage, if you like, that George had, even over Lewis, let alone over the McLaren drivers. So, yeah, maybe it's something just exclusive to Mercedes. Look at it. Maybe it's exclusive to the car that was slightly lighter as well. No, we shouldn't be saying that. And as I said at the start of the video, I don't think the weight would have been a factor in how well those tyres did last on George's car. So commiserations to George, really. I mean, we were talking yesterday about how Max had to take that 10-place grid penalty through no fault of his own. This is it was an engine thing, the internal combustion engine, and he had to suffer and start P11 and finish P5, now P4, of course. And George, to some extent, is in the same situation. Nothing to do with him. Drove a beautiful race, did everything that you could possibly do. Very few mistakes. Had a bit of a drama in the opening laps when he ran wide at Les Combes and just to rejoin the track, had to give up position. But apart from that, as far as I could see, he drove an absolutely faultless race. And to lose the win, it's always a bitter moment when you lose a Grand Prix win because of something like, a kilo or 2 underweight. Very, very unfortunate. But you wonder how it can happen, actually. The teams have so many protocols, and you'd imagine that Mercedes would be as good as anyone in terms of whatever it is, curfew, spares, lifing, all the factors that go into running a team very well. And to have a car that is underweight is, I'm not going to say it's almost inexcusable, because obviously it happens, but it's going to have to be something that is out of the ordinary, that is something unusual, something to do with wear, something to do with wear rate on the car somewhere, I would guess. But it's up to Mercedes to build in enough margin for that. And it hasn't happened. So, yeah, congratulations to Lewis Hamilton, his 2nd Grand Prix win of the year now. And a good win for him. He can't in any way feel lucky to have won this race, because he did everything that he was supposed to do. He drove the perfect race, actually. I can't think of anything that Lewis didn't do extremely well today. And And it was, in a way, it was from that grid position he had just fabulous. I mean, look what happened to Lando Norris, where he qualified and then he made a small mistake coming out of the first corner, La Source hairpin, and then look where it dropped him. And that was it for his day, really. It was too difficult for him to overtake, couldn't do it. And that could easily have happened to Lewis. If he hadn't put in that qualifying lap yesterday and he hadn't made the great start that he did, he may not have been in a position to win that race. Let's just have a look at how the Mercedes was so good today. Part of it was because I think the McLaren challenge kind of was diluted, as I say, because Lando was never really in it. And Oscar Piastri finished within a second of the two Mercedes, even though in his second pit stop, he overran the mark and the pit stop was about 2.5 seconds too long. So there you go. There's McLaren potentially winning that race with Oscar Piastri. Not to say he would have got past them, of course, but they were right there and the victory went to Mercedes. And the other question we have to ask ourselves, of course, is what would have happened had Max started from the pole that he earned in qualifying? Well, he wouldn't have been in traffic. He would have been in free air, assuming he made a good start. And he did make a good start as it happened. So, yeah, let's assume he was in the front of the race. And I think he would have won it. I think he would have won it because he wouldn't have lost so much time in dirty air. And he had that huge advantage in Sector 2 that he was never really able to play with in the race as it actually happened. So, yeah, that 10-place grid penalty was what Max Verstappen's weekend was all about from beginning to end. If you look at the top speeds when they were not in DRS, which would be various stages of the race, George Russell 324, Lewis Hamilton 325, so nothing in it there. Oscar Piastri 325, so McLaren-Mercedes on a par in terms of top speed, terminal velocity. Charles Leclerc 323, slightly slower than McLaren and Mercedes in a straight line. And Max Verstappen 325, so right up there with the others as well. Interesting, 326 Lando Norris actually. So 326 Lando Norris, 325 Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton. Very, very close. Carlos Sainz 324. Red Bull didn't have any sort of top speed advantage. I think that's one thing to say. Their advantage this weekend was in Sector 2, and they couldn't do anything with that because it was so difficult to follow other cars, and because of the 10-place grid penalty, Max was always in traffic. That's basically how his race went, and that sums it up. Sergio Perez, one thought he was going to have quite a good race. He was there on the front row of the grid. He got passed by Lewis early on, and then he kind of fell back after that. I think he gave up once he got passed by Max and cruised round, complaining at the end of the race of poor balance and not a lot of things were right. Although in fairness to him, Red Bull did run him on 2 sets of mediums and then a hard just to do something different, I guess. And in a way, it was the wrong thing to do, wasn't it? They should have taken the gamble of start on the mediums and then run one stop hard. Wonder if anybody else is going to try that. Oh yeah, George Russell. And guess what? He won the race on the road. So yeah, it would have been worth doing that with Sergio, but they didn't do that. And so again, that just brings into focus, I think, how courageous? No, I think it was just thinking on your feet and driving hard. And George Russell's really good at that. He's really good at sniffing the air and seeing where he is in any given race and looking at all the possibilities that are around, even if there's something that hasn't been talked about. And I don't think it was talked about. Judging by the radio messages to Lewis Hamilton during the race, once he'd come in for his after his second stop and he's on his final set of hard tyres. All the talk then was the gap to the car in front and how quickly he could run on those tyres, and obviously there was less load going through the tyres now, so he could push them harder into the entries of corners, and it was all just along the lines of, yep, everything's going to be fine. And then suddenly we get Lewis saying, what's the gap to George? Am I on track to win this race? And all of a sudden I think, everybody realised it was going to be very, very difficult. Difficult moment for Mercedes, you would imagine. In a way, a good moment because you always want them on different strategy if there's going to be a drama. But a difficult moment because Lewis, of course, was entitled to feel, well, why wasn't I given this option of the one-stop strategy? I thought it was quite interesting, 3 laps to go, and they said, just give one another a lot of space, they said to Lewis. I think they should have been giving that message to George, actually. But they gave that message to Lewis. And I wonder whether that changed things a little bit. I mean, that's unnecessary to say that to Lewis Hamilton, I think, because he's not the sort of driver that ever really does anything incredibly stupid, particularly with a teammate. Famous last words. We have seen it, of course. But at that stage of the race, I don't think Lewis needed to be told that. And maybe that affected his aggression a little bit, maybe. But not much he could do. I mean, if even in DRS, he couldn't pass George at the end of the straight. So that was that. So then the only thing was to maybe do something sector 2, maybe push him into a mistake or something going into Stabilo. And as I say, George went green. He went personal best sector 2 on his last lap. And that was it. End of the race. Except that Lewis did win it in the end. Wow. What a weird day. George with that strategy. Difficult to overtake, difficult to follow other cars. McLaren's challenge sort of fell away. George Russell, the hero of the day. And then suddenly he's disqualified. Wow, what a day. Belgian Grand Prix, living up. I did that little video thing after the qualifying video yesterday, just showing what happened in 1964, when 3 drivers all ran out of fuel or had problems on the last lap, and Jim Clark won the race, didn't even know he'd won it. And I said, these things often happen at Spa. And look what has happened at Spa. Not only was George Russell the surprise on-the-road winner, but then he wasn't the winner anyway after about 2 hours after the race. So very, very, very strange race as everybody goes off now to the August break. And they'll be back for the Dutch Grand Prix at Zandvoort, Max Verstappen's home race. Can't wait for that. A big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja for their support of this channel. Big thanks to you, the viewer. Have a great August. See you soon.